This is System Crash. I'm Paris Marks.
And I'm Brian Merchant. This week on the show, the Vatican has spoken and we have a Luddite Pope. The Republicans are pushing a 10-year ban on state AI regulations to sate their tech industry friends. And Trump's trip to Saudi Arabia shows the power and geopolitics behind AI. Plus, Canada's AI minister, UK artists pushing back on copyright changes, Microsoft layoffs, and much, much more.
This system has just begun to crash, so support the show by heading over to patreon.com/systemcrashpod, where you can sign up to get monthly bonus episodes. Also, rate the show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Now, Brian, you might have seen that there is a new pope who's been elected.
Conclave.
I know you were so excited, right? You were tuning in. You were like, when is the white smoke going to come out? I need to know.
I was placing my bets on Polymarket. I didn't see it. Did you see this? Like
Absolutely not. I heard that people were betting. I also read apparently in Italy it's like illegal to bet on the Pope, but apparently there's a whole load of like other ways of like kind of placing a bet without really placing a bet or something. I don't know.
Yeah, Polymarket, it's one of the more annoying stories, I feel like, that's like this persistent sort of myth that like, oh, Polymarket gets it right. Like Polymarket, is the truth because it can glean the wisdom of the markets. Well, like Polymarket had Pope Leo at like 0%. And like, so nobody even bet on that. You don't want to underestimate the American Pope, the Chicago Pope, deep dish Pope.
I did find it funny though that after it was announced, like very quickly, everyone was like, "Oh my God, the first American Pope! This is incredible! I can't believe they chose him. Like they would never choose an American Pope because America was seen as too powerful." And then in like his first like speech, like from up on the the balcony at the Vatican, he starts in Latin, he switches to Italian, then he makes a special shout out to his congregation in Peru and speaks Spanish for them, but never like utters a word of English the whole time. I was like, this is perfect. I love this. The first American Pope, not even, and he's speaking Spanish and not English.
In the words of the great American hero, Laura Loomer, woke Marxist Pope, I think is what she tweeted after we got a woke Marxist Pope here.
Well, I think we've decided that he's actually a woke Luddite Pope, right?
Yeah.
Because he's Pope Leo the 14th, if I have that correctly.
Yeah.
And the day after he was, selected to be Pope, he did his first mass and he was talking a bit about why he had chosen this name. And the previous Pope Leo was apparently advocating for workers' rights during the Industrial Revolution. And he specifically cited the fact that, now we are in this era where artificial intelligence is proving to be like a threat to workers, and the church is going to have to respond to this. And that's part of the reason why he chose to have a name that kind of harkened back to this other pope who was doing a lot to support workers during this previous time of upheaval. And that was like one of the reasons why he wanted to, kind of name himself Pope Leo over something else.
Take the name Pope. Yeah, let me read this here. In our own day, the church offers to everyone the treasury of her social teaching in response to another industrial revolution and to developments in the field of artificial intelligence that pose new challenges for the defense of human dignity, justice, and labor. Very interesting. That's pretty Luddite, taking us pro-labor stance in the context of the rise of this new technological paradigm, or something that at least he's aware and the church is aware that AI is being pushed as a large, automation technology, as something that companies all around the world are going to at least try to be using to displace labor. And so it's pretty interesting that, right out the gate, our new Chicago Pope here is sort of calling that out from the get-go.
Your Chicago Luddite Pope. Yeah, I found it really interesting, right? Because there was this discussion as to whether, the Vatican was going to shift more, in a conservative direction after having someone like Pope Francis, who was perceived to be a more progressive pope, cared about climate change, the poor, those sorts of things. He was well known for kind of calling this church in Gaza, every evening to see how they were doing as Israel was kind of carrying out its genocide in that part of the world. But when we're thinking about AI, AI, there was also this note that was released during the end of Pope Francis's papacy that was actually dealing with artificial intelligence. It was released in January. And so, after I heard those things from Pope Leo the 14th, I decided to go back and look at what was actually written there. And it was really interesting to me because I felt like a lot of the criticisms that it was presenting of AI and the framing of it was really in line with a lot of the arguments that, people like us would make around the types of things that we should be paying attention to when it comes to AI, the types of things that we should be concerned about. Obviously, it was kind of reframing that slightly around the kind of like religious language and arguments that they use and pulling from religious scripture in order to, present an argument in this way. And so I just wanted to read you like a couple things that really stood out to me from that, and then we can get into our bigger stories. But so there's this one section where they're talking about, what artificial intelligence actually is. And, in this note, it's written, human intelligence is not primarily about completing functional tasks, but about understanding and actively engaging with reality in all its dimensions. It is also capable of surprising insights. Since AI lacks the richness of corporeality, relationality, and the openness of the human heart to truth and goodness, its capacities, though seemingly limitless, are incomparable with the human ability to grasp reality. So much can be learned from an illness, an embrace of reconciliation, and even a simple sunset. Indeed, many experiences we have as humans open new horizons and offer the possibility of attaining new wisdom. No device working solely with data can measure up to these and countless other experiences present in our lives. I thought that was like a really striking way of presenting an argument that we've seen in, say, Joseph Weizenbaum decades ago, and kind of like reframing that for today in what we're experiencing as we have these debates around whether AI is really intelligent or not, right?
Yeah, it is. And it's really interesting that there was this effort to sort of, translate this into spiritual language. And it did have a big effect when Pope Francis sort of talked about sort of climate change and issued the encyclical on climate change. It's like still cited to this day, and it really did sort of galvanize large parts of the climate movement and provide some moral authority on the matter. And this was handed down on AI sort of at a different juncture, and it didn't kind of make the same level of splash, at least, or it wasn't turned to in the media as much. But I do think that it is incredibly rich. There's a big section on labor as well, and on society, of course. And so I think it'll be interesting to see how the new pope continues with all of this, and and if it chooses to sort of underline some of these key points or to return to them, because it's becoming clearer that there is just a moral case for opposing a lot of the lines put forward by the tech industry and what it's trying to do. And what's interesting to me is that, again, it's couched in the spiritual language and it's of universality, but really these are criticisms and sort of truths gleaned from looking at what a handful of tech companies are doing, essentially, right? Like, so it'll be interesting to see if that connective tissue can sort of be elaborated or drawn out or zeroed in on.
Yeah, and you think like it's a pope, it's just this religious figure. It's not like a president of a country or something like that. But there are 1.4 billion Catholics in the world. There are many more Christians beyond that who would likely respond to similar language, though they don't, see the pope as their like top religious figure. Not to mention, people of other religions, Abrahamic faiths or otherwise, who would likely, hear some of what they're saying and think, that really kind of coincides with my beliefs or kind of, aligns with them, right? And there was one more piece that I wanted to talk about because, what I pulled from before was talking specifically about AI, but there was another section that dealt with technology more broadly, and I feel like it really resonated with the types of arguments that we make. And so it was interesting to see it coming from, the church in this way. And so, it also writes, we can gratefully acknowledge how technology has remedied countless evils which used to harm and limit human beings, a fact for which we should rejoice. Nevertheless, not all technological advancements in themselves represent genuine human progress. The Church is particularly opposed to those applications that threaten the sanctity of life or the dignity of the human person. Like any human endeavor, technological development must be directed to serve human person and contribute to the pursuit of greater justice, more extensive fraternity, and a more humane order of social relations, which are more valuable than advances in the technical field. kind of calling out how, these technologies are often created because these tech founders want to create something new, or because they're trying to make all of this money, not thinking about the broader impacts that those technologies can have, or whether it's really serving the public good. And obviously with the church, they're focused on a particular idea of what public good would be or should be. But I think that general criticism is something that we talk about a lot, and that a lot of people are thinking about in this moment when we're seeing the impacts of these technologies and these companies.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, like I said, I do think that there is an interesting moment taking shape, because the tech companies that have sort of informed and constructed this paradigm to a large part have done so by heralding themselves sort of like the world changing and transformative and all encompassing nature of AI, of the technologies. And so to some extent now, like, they have to own that, right? And so all of these things that are happening now, like the things that we talked about last week, all of these issues with AI in the workplace, AI in education, where we're starting to see some very clear like moral deficits that are really getting sort of people uncomfortable and angry. And this language and these words handed down by the church may be quite, useful in sort of catalyzing some of that anger, or catalyzing some of that suspicion about the morality of these systems built into them. So there may be a broader sort of backlash that's not just encompassed to people who feel like their jobs are threatened. It may be that there is like a moral dimension, a spiritual dimension that can inform sort of resistance to these technologies.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting to think about. And, as we're talking about AI, we're talking about the church perspective, but the debates around regulation of AI are still playing out in front of us, what that might look like. And I know you really wanted to talk about this story that we're seeing play out in the United States right now with this proposed 10-year ban on AI regulation. Talk to us about that. What is going on?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is a perfect example, I think, of why there is more of a pronounced sort of resistance developing and more of a backlash to AI growing out of different corners where we might not always expect it. Because this week is such a good example of sort of what AI is ultimately for. What AI is seen as useful for by the ruling classes, by capital, by the moneyed interests that are commanding, its development and deployment as it stands. And I kind of pointed this out on Twitter or Blue Sky, but we can talk about all these little things, right? Like, or, comparatively little things like the capabilities of a given model and how efficient it is, or this versus that, or DeepSeek versus OpenAI O3, or what's Anthropic Claude's doing. But ultimately, the broader picture is inescapable. Where all of this stuff is stemming from, right? It's stemming from OpenAI, which is now valued at $300 billion, Google, Microsoft, Meta, some of the largest companies in existence, sort of deciding how these technologies are going to be used and who they're going to affect, right? So we need to understand that. And we'll talk about in a second also how most of those people were also in Saudi Arabia earlier this week, having lunch with President Trump and Saudi officials, all talking about investing hundreds of billions and even trillions of dollars into AI because they all want to have their AI hubs, which should be a red flag right there. But while this is happening, back home, look what's taking shape. We have this new amendment that has been quietly sort of thrust into the budget reconciliation bill. And it was put there by Brett Guthrie, who is the House Energy and Commerce Chair of the Republican Party in the House of Representatives. Basically, the idea is that it will ban any state level regulation of AI for 10 years. It's a moratorium on any laws that would in any way, in any meaningful way, address AI or seek to regulate AI.
Which is just absolutely wild. Like, okay, we don't want federal regulations, but all of you states, you can't touch it either, right?
Well, I mean, astonishingly, what they're arguing is that like this should be regulated at the national level, not the state level, because this is, it would be too confusing. Companies can't, compete if they're following different regulations here and there, which is like astonishing. It's the exact inverse of what they argued last year when the Republicans were lobbying to, strike down the laws governing abortion. And so they were saying, well, this should be really should be up to the states how they wanted it. This is states' rights. This is, the United States is a laboratory of democracy. The states decide. But when it's an issue of, of business, of capital, then suddenly, well, no. So
it brings to mind years ago when California was trying to bring in its own like fuel emission standards or whatever that were going to be like a higher standard than what the federal government was setting. And there were all of these like court battles as to whether it was going to be able to do that. And in the end, I believe they were given the right to set those like higher standards on the state level. So you wonder like if it's going to end up being some kind of fight like that once again, right?
Well, so yeah, I mean, this is for those outside the United States or for those who, aren't necessarily familiar with our form of governance here with good old federalism.
Best democracy in the world, right?
yeah, what's left of it anyways. So basically, the reason that they want to ban this in the first place is because a state like California, which is, on a given day, the fifth or sixth largest economy in the world when taken on its own, can set its own rules. And by and large, it can, especially when it comes to sort of issues that affect commerce or the market, then it sort of becomes sort of a de facto standard in a lot of cases, as it did with cars. So the reason why that was such a big deal and that California sort of paved the way in doing this way back in the 90s, creating the California Air and Resource Board that regulated tailpipe emissions and has done undeniable good to the state and the world in reducing the amount of emissions that can come out of an exhaust pipe. There's just no way to argue. It's just one of the most immense health benefits, demonstrable, observable health benefits in the world. I'm old enough to have been to LA, where I live now, in the 90s before the effects of this were felt, and it was the smog-ridden hellhole that it, continues to somewhat, be mythologized as. You could, like, I was astonished. Like, it was like that blood red sun, like underneath, like a smoggy, thanks to the efforts of sort of California's clean air laws, which the manufacturers said, okay, if you're going to have this law, then we might as well make our cars, cleaner everywhere and just sell them that way everywhere. So everybody benefits. So industry is immensely aware of the power of California's, civic process and its market. And so the tech companies have really trained their sights on California in particular and on, a number of other states that like New York and Colorado that kind of do this kind of thing.
It's like no surprise that this thing is emerging on the federal level from Republicans there who have the backing of the tech industry at the same moment that California is trying to move forward with its own AI legislation that these companies obviously do not want, right?
Yeah. And I mean, and I know it's a little all over the place because there's so many moving parts to this. But yeah, that is the bottom line. Since Trump took power and it became clear as day that there was going to be little to no, let's just go with no meaningful federal regulation, the AI company said, okay, well, now our issue is going to be with California, with the states, because California can still pass these laws. And in fact, almost did pass a law that would have been quite impactful to the tech companies, enforcing them to sort of change the way that they build and share data about their models. It's a very controversial bill. It was an AI safety bill put forward by Scott Wiener. And, if it was up to me, like, obviously that would not be my priority in legislating. But there's an influential faction in Silicon Valley and in California that is really worried about, existential risk. And so this bill would have, forced some more transparency and it would have had some knock-on good effects, but it was ultimately vetoed by Gavin Newsom. But there were other bills that, a few bills that did pass, and then there were a bunch of bills that sort of made it to Sacramento and made it to the governor's desk that he vetoed or didn't sign, and they took sort of some of the criticism, and then they went back to the lab and now they're trying them again. So there's something like 30 bills in California, and these bills are doing a number of different things, and some of them are really quite good. They have measures in them to prevent worker surveillance, for instance. There's a no robot bosses or no robo bosses act that would prevent an algorithm from automatically making hiring and firing decisions, and it protects against discrimination. It requires that employers sort of share information about the AI that they're using with their workers. There's another one that bans facial recognition in the workplace without employee consent. It prevents surveillance. All of these things that a lot of them are very pro-worker. The California Labor Federation has backed 3 of these bills at least. And this is what Silicon Valley wants to crush, right? Because it is out there selling AI as an automation technology, as an automation tool. And if California says, oh, okay, in California, you have to give your workers these protections, this information. You can't use it to surveil. Well, suddenly, number one, other people start saying, oh, maybe we should do that too. Maybe our workers also don't want to be surveilled by AI systems or subject to the discrimination of automated systems, and then gives folks ideas to export that.
It sets an important precedent for those other spots.
It sets a precedent, right? And it undercuts the already sort of pretty flimsy value proposition of the generative AI automation software too. So OpenAI and Meta and IBM, all the AI companies have been like really they've been going to Washington trying to find ways to put the kibosh on all of this from the federal level. Really, really anti-democratic stuff, really nasty stuff.
It really brings to mind, when there were those legal fights around the gig economy and the regulation of companies like Uber. And early on, you had Uber kind of lobby at the state level to ensure that they preempted cities. So, a city like San Francisco wouldn't be able to kind of enforce taxi regulations on a company like Uber, and make sure that the state would set more lax regulations. And then later, when it became clear the state was going to move forward and do something, then move forward with like a Proposition 22, which we saw to really gut any kind of effort to make these workers employees or give them the types of rights that they would want. And it feels like now what we're seeing with the AI industry is they see that there is a real threat to the business model that they are trying to, kind of build the foundation of this industry on. And so they are going as hard as they can to ensure, rather than getting a state to preempt a municipality, kind of getting the federal government to say, all you states can't do anything.
Yeah, 100%. That's right. I think more and more I am seeing like Uber and sort of the gig apps as sort of like the dry run for what the AI companies are trying to do. And then, sort of one-upping them or 10xing them, as Silicon Valley might say, right? So they're I think right now they're thinking like, oh my God. I mean, you remember they've smuggled in to the White House a number of very influential sort of AI boosters and tech oligarchs, Elon Musk, David Sachs, Mark Andreessen, who's, advising the White House on policy. These are all guys who have really supported. I mean, Elon Musk is complicated a little bit because he's kind of also into the AI safety thing, but especially Mark Andreessen, who, if you believe current reports coming out of the White House, is just as influential as Musk in dictating tech policy right now. He has been sort of adamant that there should be this quote light touch regulation, which means no regulation, that little tech, as we've talked about on this show, should be, given the chance to thrive. And that doesn't mean necessarily breaking up big tech, although it might, but put a peg in that. But It means no regulation. It means no guardrails. It means eliminating anything that might slow down people like Mark Andreessen's returns on profit because they're venture capitalists investing heavily in the AI space and almost nothing else at this point. So they have this really sort of pressing and like sort of urgent language around the need, I guess, and we'll talk about China too, getting into China. Like they all talk about China as a big, motivator. JD Vance went to Europe, as we've talked about also on this show, and said that the age of like AI safety and AI regulation is over. This is all about AI dominance, American AI dominance. And you can see all of these rivers now feeding into this trough. And the tech companies like Sam Altman going, we can do this. We can ban states from regulating. We don't have to do what Uber did and set up like a little policy shop or a lobbying shop in every major municipality and like sort of break the law in small ways and get slapped on the wrist, small ways comparatively to our coffers. We can just go right to the federal government and say, you know what? Like this technology is too powerful, too transformative. We need to ban states from getting in the way of it. Otherwise, A, we'll lose the race to China. B, little tech companies won't be able to compete and, we'll miss out on this opportunity to sort of, it really is just a perfect example of how the tech industry has concentrated power and both, economic power, obviously, but also political power, and now is kind of unafraid to wield it.
Yeah, I think it's such an important observation, right? And to see how they're acting in this moment and how they are trying to cement their power. Obviously there have been a lot of discussions about AI as a bubble and, whether this data center build out is still going to make sense. But it's like they are trying to use the structural power that they have amassed to ensure that regardless of what happens, they are protected and this can continue. And so I wanted to ask you, as we kind of end off the discussion of this particular bill, what is the chance that this actually moves through? You were talking about this being in like a budget reconciliation process. Does that mean it is likely going to end up passed? Are there avenues to still kind of sideline this thing to make sure it doesn't make it through? What are you seeing there?
Yeah. So a typical bill, and again, this is, I think, why we need to sort of raise the alarm bells as loudly as possible. And people are upset about this. Like people are angry. It is causing some backlash, apart from the brazen hypocrisy of like this party that just said it's all about state rights, making this big effort to wipe them out.
State rights, but only where the state rights matter for our political priorities.
Right. Just classic naked hypocrisy. But so the reconciliation process, the important thing to know there is that a budget bill can pass with just a bare majority in the Senate. That's really so 51 votes is all it needs. A typical bill to pass the Senate needs 60 votes. It's supposed to be a check on, the Senate, which also why like nothing serious has gotten done in the United States in like 10 years. But being that as it may, but there's this rule that was enshrined into law decades ago called the Byrd Rule. And that stipulates that anything added to the budget reconciliation process has to be directly related to spending or revenues. So you can't just ban, abortion in the budget reconciliation process. You can't sort of address other social issues. It's supposed to be, to prevent this kind of thing from happening. It's supposed to be just budgetary matters only. And, you run into, conflicts like this from time to time, but this is a different, administration, a different Republican Party, one that, any sort of interest in adhering to norms and standards and even laws a lot of the time has gone out the window. So I think there's like, would this pass the Byrd Rule? Like, actually, if it was given like a methodical, rational, sort of even-keeled look? No, of course not. It's ridiculous. In fact, I should add that I was curious as to, what their thinking was. So I called Guthrie's office up and we talked I didn't talk to Guthrie. I talked to somebody on background, so I can't quote from it directly. But the thinking largely is that they're going to argue that they need AI to modernize agencies like the FTC and the Commerce Department. They're using AI tools to sort of to make the function of these agencies more efficient and more modern. And in order to do that, they need to use AI tools. Well, if AI is being regulated in the states, then the cost of those AI tools might go up. So therefore, it's a budget. I mean, I try.
What a
Yeah,
wild argument.
I mean,
Like,
literally anything could apply to that. You can't pass minimum wage laws because labor costs will go up. Oh, you can't
yeah.
pass laws in the real estate market because the price of the rental market for federal buildings might go up. You can't, it's just totally stupid. It's like maybe the dumbest thing I've ever heard.
But it's like, also given how the Republicans are governing in this moment, it's like they just need the excuse. Maybe they don't even need that. And they're just going to kind of go through and do whatever it is they want. We can see the Trump administration right now, kind of breaching all these supposed limitations on the presidency and the executive branch that are supposed to be held by the legislative branch. And it just doesn't matter because they're not going to do anything about it, it looks like.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that's kind of what they're banking on. Like, but I mean, this is so wild, and you can kind of, if you look back 2 or 3 months, you can see where all this is taking shape. And this is for more if you want to see more about this is what I'm writing in the newsletter about this week. So you could see Mark Andreessen, of course, this little tech thing, the light touch regulation. Both Ted Cruz and Guthrie held committee hearings that were attended by folks like Sam Altman, Microsoft's Brad Smith, Scale AI's Alexander Wang, and you could see they're each putting forward sort of, different ingredients that will wind up in this bill. Eric Schmidt made that. We dedicated a whole episode, bonus episode. Check it out. It's a good one.
Yeah, the most recent bonus.
Yeah, the
bonus
very
episode.
last one. To Eric Smith, going to Congress and making these wild claims about how we just need to, put everything else aside, give as much energy as possible to AI development and powering data centers. And don't worry, it's going to solve climate change if you're worried about that, because once we have AI, it'll solve climate change. But we need to beat China. And Guthrie, the sponsor of this amendment of this bill, he quotes Eric Schmidt directly. So they're all just ingesting all of this ideology, little tech, gotta beat China, no regulation. And it's all sort of being sort of front loaded and really pushed out into this. I mean, this is, it's hard to understate how insane this is and how much power this would hand the tech. It would mean no meaningful regulation, no laws in America about how AI is used. Because federal government's not going to do it.
Yeah, when you mention that, it makes me think of like a lot of things the United States do with like deregulation and setting these really like minimal regulatory frameworks for a lot of sectors. I think of when we were at that Asilomar meeting earlier this year, and they were talking about how the United States set this really kind of low bar for biotech that was not reflected in other parts of the world. And so, you kind of see it as a reflection of this trajectory. But, we're talking about the power of these tech companies and how they're wielding it in the United States to try to pass this bill. But as you mentioned earlier, we saw another example of that this week as well, when President Donald Trump took the trip to Saudi Arabia and, to other Gulf monarchies. But at the time that we're recording, we've only seen the results of the Saudi Arabian part of that trip. And, a lot of these tech CEOs and executives were with him. Elon Musk, of course, was front and center, but Amazon CEO and a number of others were with him. And, the announcement that we got from that was this big, $600 billion in commitments from Saudi Arabia for various investments in the United States and that are going to like affect American tech companies. And this is like a really huge and significant move for many different reasons.
For me, anyways, it's sometimes like we know that it's true. We know where the levers of power reside and who is pulling them. But sometimes it's just like useful to have an unignorable portrait painted where you could just see all of these men, they're mostly men, of course, sitting in a room in Saudi Arabia with Donald Trump talking about AI and building the future and AI hubs and all of this stuff. So, yeah, there's, I think, some 40 people that were there, or that CEOs and the executives. There's 4 representatives from the 10 biggest companies in the world. There's Elon Musk, Sam Altman, but like, just this is just such a nightmare blunt rotation here. So we got Larry Fink, the chief executive of BlackRock. We have Elon Musk, of course, Tesla, SpaceX, Andy Jassy, CEO of Amazon, Sam Altman, OpenAI, Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, Alex Karp, chief executive of Palantir. Good one. Jeff Miller, sort of under the radar these days, but CEO of Halliburton. An oldie but a goodie, Travis Kalanick, the former
Oh,
founder of Uber. He got in there.
what's Cloud Kitchen doing over in Saudi
Yeah,
Arabia? That was his
I know.
follow up, right? Yeah,
It's like ghost kitchen startup. Like, it's like
yeah.
Uber for food or something. That Dara Khosrow, yeah,
Khosrowshahi,
the CEO of Uber today. You got the CEO of Coke, of Northrop Grumman, the president of FIFA for some reason, Reid
the
Hoffman.
CEO of Coke, is telling them how they can very effectively make AI generated advertising for their brands.
That's right. Yeah. Case studies aplenty. And I'd be remiss without mentioning my former employer, Patrick Soon-Shiong, the executive chairman of Immunity Bio and the owner of the Los Angeles Times.
Ugh.
So all of these guys, that's just, obviously there's folks from Google there, from IBM, like and this is, and they're talking about hundreds of billions and trillions of dollars of investment squeezed together, concentrated into their special little projects, and not a lot of talk about how AI is going to benefit all of humanity in these meetings.
That's how they're going to come out and sell it later, you know? Yeah. It's going to help to contribute to the liberalization of Saudi society, I'm sure, and giving women more rights, generative AI, you know? Like,
Yeah. Definitely not to crush dissidents, to immiserate workers, and to funnel more profits upstream. Absolutely not. Yeah.
no. And, one of the key parts of the deals was this $142 billion advanced weapons deal. And there's not much information about, what that is going to cover yet. But I was even wondering to myself, I was like, man, Palantir and like, these kind of tech defense companies need to be part of this. And of course, I should have known Alex Karp was going to be part of this mission. Palantir is certainly going to be, getting its chunk of that. But then on top of it, we have, this deal for NVIDIA to sell hundreds of thousands of advanced AI chips to Saudi Arabia as they're setting up this new company, Humane, that aims to develop like an advanced AI industry in the country. And this is notable because under the Biden administration last year, Saudi Arabia was put on a kind of a restrictions list for access to chips, along with a number of other countries that really pissed off even a lot of American allies around the world. Even places like Israel and Poland were put on that list to a certain degree. And Trump has announced in recent days that those curbs are going to be rolled back ahead of this deal with Saudi Arabia. We know AMD will also be selling a lot of chips to Saudi Arabia as part of this. And there's already talk that there's going to be a big deal like this happening in the United Arab Emirates as well, where they're looking to build a huge AI industry. And then a few other things as part of that. Amazon is apparently going to spend $5 billion in Saudi Arabia to build an AI zone. Google is looking at investing in Saudi startups. There's all of this kind of back and forth of money that's supposedly going both ways to strengthen the ties between the United States and Saudi Arabia, of all places.
Yeah. And I think it's notable also that this is like defense and AI. And, it's in the same breath. And so it's pretty clear, from a geopolitical position, what the interest is in AI. The interest here is in systems of control and of immiseration, right? In means of immiserating workers. And I think that it's notable and really important to understand that AI is sharing the billing with defense, right? These are AI and defense initiatives. That's what the 150 billion is for, or the 600 billion is for. And as these Gulf states build their AI hubs and OpenAI sort of, uses Saudi money to build its mega data centers back home, I think we should be like expressly interested in the commonalities here. What these enormous institutions and countries are interested in this technology so pointedly for, right? It's not so that their citizens can write better marketing emails. No, they're interested in AI as a means of control, of surveillance, of wielding power. That's why they're adopting these models that are so not unlike the models of cornering an oil market or extracting oil and then hoarding the oil, right? They see this potential in the technology as one that can bestow them, great power to put their thumb on dissidents, to depress wages of workers. I mean, this is really, I think, very clarifying to see both of these two things, as we mentioned up top, happening in this week. We see like our government trying to eradicate any means of actually democratizing this technology and keeping it free from democratic input in the United States. And then we see profoundly authoritarian regimes pumping the money into the ecosystem, into the AI sort of paradigm overseas. This is the structure of AI. This is how AI is organized. This is what AI is. It is Gulf states pledging over $1 trillion to develop means of technological control and surveillance, and for American tech companies to locate vast new streams of profit potentially so that they benefit. That's what AI is. Everything else is taking place within this context.
No, that's exactly right. And it also shows that AI is inherently like a geopolitical technology, right? In the sense that, sure, on the one hand, these deals show that the Trump administration only really cares about, making deals, getting investment into the United States, doesn't care who it's from or the quality of those countries and those regimes. There was always this talk about how the United States cared about human rights and all this kind of bullshit, blah, blah, blah. But, kept working really closely with the Saudis. And it really brings to mind like this image that we're seeing of, remember how there was that trip that Mohammed bin Salman did to Silicon Valley years ago and like met all the CEOs, and it was like, this kind of like love in. They all wanted to get to know him because he had all the money. And then of course Saudi Arabia chopped up Jamal Khashoggi, and it was like, oh, well, we can't really be close to them anymore. All of that is out the window. Who cares that they butcher journalists, not to mention what they do with the people in their own country. But the other piece of this that I think is really important is, there was discussion last year about how the United States was going to work with the Gulf monarchies, the Gulf states, and especially around advanced technologies and AI and chips. And like I mentioned, Biden had these curbs on the ability of the UAE and Saudi Arabia to access advanced chips from the United States. But last year, we know that Microsoft made a deal with G42, which is, one of the companies in the UAE, in Abu Dhabi, to basically, partner on data centers and AI and those sorts of things. And that was in part arranged by the US government in collaboration with the government in the UAE. And part of that was about reducing the relationship that they were going to have with China and cooperation with China on technology as well. Now, there were some issues with that deal later in the year where they were concerned that the UAE was too close to China to kind of give them advanced chips and those sorts of things. But I think that these deals that we're seeing play out this week with Saudi Arabia and with the UAE, yes, they're illustrative for all the reasons that you laid out, but they also show us that the United States is very interested in using this technology and the prospect of, everything that AI is going to be to cement its relationships as it sees its kind of power and influence in the world potentially diminishing as China rises. And these deals with Saudi Arabia and the UAE are about keeping them within like the American camp, the American alliance. It doesn't matter what type of government they are. It doesn't matter how shitty they are. They have a lot of money. They have been long-term American partners. They will be influential in the world moving forward. And we want to keep them in the American orbit. So we're going to make these deals with them. We're going to transfer them these chips. We're going to allow them to try to become these like technological superpowers or whatnot as well, as long as they stay subservient it to, the kind of American technological agenda within the orbit of it, working with American tech companies and funding them. As long as that remains, then they can have these capabilities. Otherwise, they would vehemently fight against it and try to stop them from obtaining these technologies.
Yeah, and notably, who we are not partnering with anymore, and who we were sending a signal that you can either sort of follow us and get on board or get lost, which is Europe. The fact that Europe has made the smallest gesture, not to discount, some of their policies on AI, but it's not like they're so constrictive that AI can't operate there. There are still big AI startups in Europe, but the regulations and sort of interventions that they do have so offended American tech companies and sort of their partners and sort of cooperators in the state that Europe is out, Saudi Arabia is in, right? And things have been maybe trending that way for a little while, but this is, again, it's another just reflection. As you said, it is like both sort of a reflection and entrenchment of sort of American power and values. And as Canada and Australia and Europe kind of fall to the wayside, and America sort of tries to run roughshod over them and say, oh, you should be the 51st state, or like, you get rid of all your regulations because you're losers, and sort of just dismisses former allies in lieu of just sort of where the pure capital and the unrestrained capital can still flow, and where it can be pumped into, which is, as of right now, AI. So I just think it's incredibly illustrative.
Oh, it's startling, right? I was thinking about this the other day because, obviously we saw this kind of back and forth between Pakistan and India, over Kashmir and things that are happening over there. And India basically told the social media companies and the streaming platforms to block Pakistani content in India with everything that was going on. And we basically heard not a peep about it. Like, the companies followed through. Of course they were going to do it. But if we saw even, minimal regulations on social media or things like that happening in Europe, or, we think about what happened with Brazil, where they said to Elon Musk and to Twitter to, take down these accounts that were kind of threatening the government and democracy down there. And, for a while, Elon Musk held out to the degree that Twitter was like temporarily banned. It's like in these actually like properly democratic countries, when there's democratic support to take these things on, you have the American tech companies pushing back so forcefully. But when we have these increasingly authoritarian countries, obviously India is a democracy, but we know the type of government the Modi government is over there, that it's all well and good if the Saudis or India's kind of fascist government want us to take these measures that if it was happening in Europe, we would freak out about and lose our minds about. But when it's these countries who do it, it's totally acceptable. We don't care, totally fine. Let's continue to get their investments and work with them and things like that. You see both sides of this so clearly. What do you think, Brian? We switch to our final stories of the week.
Yeah, let me end with just if you're a listener and, if there was something that you were planning on making noise about, or you wanted to make noise about, I think this is a new front, I think. I mean, the ban on state level regulation of AI and the de facto kind of ban on any rulemaking or lawmaking or regulating of AI at all in the United States. I don't know what sort of else would be a larger red flag about how this industry plans on operating or is operating. I mean, I don't want to hear anybody else from this industry talk about how AI promises to democratize this or that. This is now a profoundly anti-democratic technology. And I think what we need to find ways to push back, or I think that the damage could be immense. This technology will be used even again, if it's not as powerful as the AI advocates say it is, which it almost certainly is not. It will be used as an excuse to undermine working conditions, to cut wages, to introduce surveillance into the workplace. And if we don't have any tools, any legal recourse against that at all, our backs are really going to be to the walls here. And I think, I just think this is such a monstrous proposition. It's such a slap in the face to the already withering husk of American democracy. And this is something that, we need to make noise about. There's been a lot of sort of prompts on Blue Sky and that you could call your congressperson and make some noise about, but I'll certainly be following this. It doesn't get much worse than this if you're concerned about AI and democracy and technological exploitation. So just want to say, just get ready to shout about this one in case it does go the way that the Republicans are hoping it does.
Absolutely. No, very important point. So, final stories of the week. First up, Canada has a new AI minister. Evan Solomon is the Minister for Artificial Intelligence and Digital Innovation. We have talked about this on the show in the past where Mark Carney, while being better than the Conservative, has said some concerning things about AI and data centers and, the like of that. And so seeing him appoint a Minister for Artificial Intelligence was a bit of a red flag the other day, especially who he chose. For people outside of Canada, they might not be familiar with Evan Solomon. He was a former broadcaster at the CBC and moved to CTV after there was a scandal where he was using his position to sell art to the guests who came on his show on the CBC. And one of the people who he sold art to was none other than Mark Carney.
And now he's hoping to sell some more AI-generated art. I see.
Exactly. Yeah. I wonder if he's into NFTs,
Well, speaking of AI-generated art, artists and musicians in the UK are urging the government to rethink its AI copyright plans. From Bloomberg, we have a story that top UK artists, including Paul McCartney, Elton John, and Dua Lipa, have urged Prime Minister Keir Starmer to strengthen copyright protections ahead of a critical vote on rules governing AI next week. There are 400 more signatories, and they call this new proposal from the government one that would leave creators vulnerable to, quote, years of copyright theft. Let's hope the House of Lords listens to their most storied musicians here.
Fingers crossed. And I was really happy to see, as a Lord of the Rings fan, Ian McKellen, who played Gandalf, was on the list as well. So I was like, oh yeah.
So perhaps he told Keir Starmer that when it comes to AI, thou shall not pass.
Exactly right. Thank you for doing that. Next up, we've heard about the kind of oversupply of Cybertrucks and how Tesla sales are going down. Well, there's a new story that apparently Tesla told workers making Cybertruck and Model Y to stay home for a week because inventory keeps piling up and they can't actually sell the cars. So, more signals that things are not going so great at Tesla, and we love to see it.
We love to see it. This is a fun one. Klarna, we all might remember Klarna as one of the most exuberant and enthusiastic adopters of OpenAI technologies. It claims it was replacing its workforce with AI. It was so excited to do so. Its quotes and testimonials are shared on OpenAI's own homepage as examples of how great this labor-saving technology is. Well, not so much anymore. Klarna is now saying it's plotting a rare recruitment drive so that the customers actually have the option of speaking to a real person in what Bloomberg describes as a sign that the Swedish fintech's commitment to AI has its limits. And I think that it's just very quickly worth underlining here that the damage has likely been done. So they say, oh, we're going to do it with AI. We'll fire hundreds of people. It didn't go so well. Now we'll hire some people back, but in Uber-like contract positions. So they have already succeeded in breaking down working conditions and justifying paying their workers left. Thanks, OpenAI.
Absolutely. This is what we talk about all the time, right? This is the real goal. It's to kill the workers' rights. Next up, we've talked about, or, even earlier, we talked about these, bills targeting social media and things like that. I think last week we mentioned the Australian bill and how New Zealand was following it to ban under 16s from social media. Well, there was this interesting report in Bloomberg that, kind of youth social media bills are expanding across Asia, not just Australia and New Zealand, but in places like Vietnam, Indonesia, countries like that, where they are looking at other types of restrictions on usage of social media. And of course, we also had this story recently that China has expanded its kind of limitations on the types of things that young people, that kids can see, when they're using these types of platforms, to make sure that they're not seeing all of this potential content, but is limited to stuff that would potentially be safe for kids, right? Which, I think is going to continue to advance this conversation on what should social media look like, what should kids on social media be able to see, and how this is going to play out in different societies. And, it's probably good, right? Because we'll be able to see some experimentation, what works and what doesn't, and hopefully that will inform a better way forward.
Absolutely. Microsoft is laying off 6,000 workers despite beating earnings expectations in its first quarter this year. Make of that what you will, as Microsoft itself continues to be one of the chief purveyors of the AI boom. And speaking of the AI boom, one final thing I will shout out here is, if you have a story about how AI has impacted your workplace or your job, or if it has put you out of a job altogether, I have started soliciting testimonials. I put a call out last week. It's called AI Killed My Job. It's a project that I'm hoping to sort of better understand sort of the impact on workplaces that AI is actually having. It's not always showing up in useful ways in the jobs data, but there are so many anecdotes and so many stories of AI being used, if not, but sometimes to replace workers altogether, then to degrade working conditions, to change workflows, to immiserate workers. As I keep saying this episode, there's a theme there. Anyways, I've gotten great stories. I've gotten over 50 great stories so far. Thank you so much to everyone who's sent them in. Please do share your story if you'd like. I will keep you confidential unless you would like to have it shared. You can find more about that on my newsletter at Blood in the Machine.
Yeah, great thing to do. And final story, and with a fun one after all this, right? Brian, you remember a couple of years ago when David Zaslav, the brilliant executive over at Warner Discovery, decided to rename HBO Max as Max because, obviously people wanted more things than just HBO. Well, Wednesday, as we record this, he has announced that they're reversing on that because people aren't watching so much of the slop that they put onto Max, the stuff from Discovery that they thought everyone would want to consume. And so it's going to be called HBO Max once again.
You rarely see this. You rarely see like the full-on walk back. They're like, never mind. Like, never, because everybody was like, HBO is a premium brand that you have spent literally decades building up. Some of the most famous and most prestigious TV shows of all time. The Sopranos, The Wire, it's HBO. Why would you get rid of that? And then it's just nice to see it back.
If anyone should be replaced by a chatbot, I think it might be David Zaslav.
Hey, HBO could save they could save some money there. They could afford to host more
$50
shows.
million odd dollars that they pay him. So yeah, they could pay for a couple of shows, I think, or at least episodes. All right. Well, I think that's it for this week, Brian. What do you think?
I think that's a good place to leave it. Thanks for crashing with us. I just thought of that. How have we've never, have we said that before?
I love that.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
It's going to have to be
Look
our
at
new
that.
thing. Yeah.
All right. This is magic happening. You're listening to it. And then thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
System Crash is hosted by Paris Mars and Brian Merchant. Production is by Eric Wickham. Our theme music is Dystopia by our good friends in Yacht. Support the show on patreon.com/systemcrashpod to get a monthly bonus episode. Thanks for listening.